2013 marks the 60th anniversary of the Republic of Korea-United States alliance. However, despite overlapping interests and policy priorities between ROK and U.S., the alliance faces great uncertainty going forward. With a staunch pro-alliance South Korean president in office and a U.S. administration keen to reassert America's role in Asia, is this a golden opportunity to revitalize and deepen the alliance?
Welcome to Session 3, Challenges for the ROK-US Alliance. As the video mentions, this is the 60th anniversary of the alliance. We know that President Park is going to be in Washington next week. I'm actually hoping that we can avoid getting into the details of that and kind of stay at a broader level. And in fact, what I'm hoping that we can explore in this panel is really 5 areas. One is the sustainability of the alliance. Secondly, the scope of the alliance. Third, the common purposes or glue that hold the alliance together. Fourth, limits potentially to the alliance, and in particular, the potential or concern about possible diverging interests between the U.S. and South Korea. And then also any limits that might be imposed or affected by China's rise. And I just want to also, open by citing a study of alliances, an IR study that looked at the duration of alliances over the course of the past 200 years. And I thought that this was very interesting because the average alliance between two countries lasts a little bit more than a decade. But this alliance has lasted for 60 years, so I think it's important for us to understand that this alliance has been particularly durable, but also we need to try to dig in and understand why that is. And so we've got 4 panelists who are going to help us to explore these issues. I'll briefly introduce the panel, and then they'll each give presentations as we've been doing in the previous sessions. So to my immediate left is Mr. Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at Cato Institute. He is a former visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and he's a prolific writer and editor, including of a book called Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire. I don't know, it doesn't tell me exactly when that came out, but it sounds recent. To his left is Victor Cha, Senior Advisor and Korea Chair of the Center for Strategic International Studies and Director of Asian Studies. He holds the D.S. Song KF Chair at Georgetown University. He also is a former government official, having served as Director for Asian Affairs at the White House on the National Security Council. And this is actually an older book that we're highlighting, but he is the award-winning author of Alignment Despite Antagonism, the U.S., Korea, Japan Security Triangle. And the topic of the book and its research it seems, is increasingly ever more relevant as we look at relations in the region. We have an empty chair. Dr. Kim Tae-hyo is on his way, and he will join us shortly, but in order to facilitate things, I just want to say that he's a professor in the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at Sungkyunkwan University. He just last year left the Blue House as Senior Presidential Secretary for National Security Strategy under the Lee Myung-bak administration. And he is the co-author of Foreign Policy in the 21st Century and the editor of a book called The Future of U.S.-Korea-Japan Relations, Balancing Values and Interests. And then on the other end is Professor Shen Dingli, Professor and Associate Dean at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies. You've probably already seen him on previous panel today. and he is a professor of international security, China-U.S. relations, China's foreign policy. His book is Financial Crisis and Asia's International Relations. He is a specialist on many aspects of U.S.-China relations and also non-proliferation issues. So that is our panel. I want to ask each of the panelists to open us with about 5 minutes of comments, starting with Doug, and we'll move down the line as a way of getting started. So Doug, over to you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to participate and the Asan Institute's willingness to invite me. I think it's a very interesting time to think about international relations as well as Asian security. And there are obviously significant challenges to the U.S.-ROK alliance. I'm fairly notorious for my views on the issue, and I'm glad to present them here. I think many of those challenges grow out of good news. That is the transformation of the threat environment and the economic environment of East Asia. That if one looks at South Korea, Japan, ASEAN today, one looks at the end of the Cold War, the transformation of China, the world in which this alliance exists today is radically different than the world 60 years ago, and we can be very thankful for that. One aspect of that is the Korean balance. That is, if one thinks of the two primary protagonists on the peninsula, one couldn't imagine a greater difference today than 60 years ago. And not just in terms of literal military balance today, but what it could be, given the South's dramatic superiority in terms of economics, population, technology, and international relationships. And also, I think the alliance relationships of both parties, that it is much, I think, less likely today that one would see either Russian or Chinese support for North Korean aggression, that the question of South Korea's ability in terms of defending itself is very different than it was in 1950. And I think that's affected by a couple of other factors that do matter in the U.S., one of which is the generational change within South Korea, that when we're seeing who is taking charge, what their memories are of American participation, the attitudes towards the alliance. It's a much more equivocal and I think at times volatile picture of support for the alliance than it was immediately after the war. And second are sunshine policy, Kaesong, some of these issues. It's been picked up recently in the U.S. Congress with a view that if North Korea is going to be threatening the entire world with incineration, why in fact are tens of millions of dollars being shipped to North Korea by the supposed intended victim of North Korean aggression? That I think that what you're seeing in the U.S. is at least some skepticism of some of these policies that seem to run counter to the vision that a military alliance is required. If one is required, why does one seemingly subsidize the potential aggressor? I think the second issue of transformation is a larger context, which is no more Cold War. That Korea mattered very much for the United States in 1950 because it was tied to this larger hegemonic contest with the Soviet Union. The perception that a gain anywhere for international communism would be a loss for the free coalition. One can argue about the start of the war and the role of the Soviets. Nevertheless, there is that sense that the Korean conflict played into a much larger battle that is simply gone, thankfully. So in terms of America's interest in the peninsula, it's a very different interest. There's still interests, obviously. But the larger threat environment faced by the United States, I would argue there's no there there. The U.S. dominates the globe. It spends roughly 40% of the world's military spending. Its primary threat is terrorism. It's not any traditional conventional threat. So the role Korea plays in that is very different than it did in 1950. So America's incentives in terms of the alliance are very different. In terms of unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, even the post office is broke in the United States and needs money. So these kinds of financial obligations will put extraordinary kind of pressure on the Pentagon budget. And to the extent this at some point becomes a political issue where it is presented as you can have your Medicare benefits or you can fund alliances around the world for wealthy trading partners, I can tell you how the vote is going to go. In America's nursing homes and assisted living facilities and retirees in America are not going to be as impressed about America's military presence. And I think this is going to put continuing pressure. The Pentagon budget is going to come under a lot of stress. And even among Republicans, we're starting to see a break from the consistent support for increased military spending. I think another very important factor is the issue of kind of the China-North Korean relationship in two ways, one of which is the U.S. is going to see this alliance very much in a dual-use fashion, particularly in, if not containing, at least constraining China. That the view that troops here should be used elsewhere in the region, and by that parenthetically, if there's a contingency in the Taiwan Strait or something else. Now, to the extent that that's the case, it's going to be much harder to get China's cooperation in putting pressure on North Korea that could lead to reunification of the peninsula. I think Beijing, understandably, is not terribly anxious to encourage reunification that leads to a united Korea allied with the United States where U.S. troops are on its border, if not literally in the Yalu, at least in the country bordering China. Very hard to encourage the Chinese to do more to accelerate that, even if they would feel forced to accept that if it occurred. Moreover, I think the issue of, to the extent that one sees in the U.S. North Korea as less of a threat for South Korea than China, that's going to put pressure in terms of South Korea as well, its view of the alliance. Is South Korea willing to play a dual-use relationship that looms larger in America's eyes? Is South Korea willing to play a role that conceivably would turn it into an enemy of China over contingencies in East Asia that are much more important potentially for the United States than South Korea? I think there are going to be tensions there to the extent that the alliance is looked at as something beyond just the Korean Peninsula, but the changing balance on the Korean Peninsula makes it harder just to limit it to the Korean Peninsula. When you put all of this together, I think it's going to put a lot of pressure on the alliance in coming years. The question then is, what else out there? I think there are a number of alternatives that one has to look at, or at least supplements to the existing alliance. I think one is greater cooperation among democratic states in the region. That certainly means South Korea and Japan. We all know the historical problems there, as well as territorial disputes. The Japanese government does not help on these issues with shrine visits and a number of other things. Nevertheless, if one thinks about a way to channel Chinese behavior, I think it's going to be much more important for countries in the region to work together, and that cooperation should reach as far away as India. That if one looks at the geopolitical environment through ASEAN into India, there are an awful lot of countries that are very nervous about sharp elbows from Beijing, which have the capability to work together. I think second is the question of trying to create regional institutions, one of which can include China, and the second of which is to encourage countries to work together to constrain China. ASEAN, I think, demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of that approach. Nevertheless, I think that's very important. Third, I think it's very important to think about increased military spending of countries in this region. If the U.S. is going to spend 5% of its GDP to defend other countries, it would be helpful if countries in the region would spend at least that to defend themselves. I think that's going to be something. If China, I think, is looking towards deterring the U.S. involvement in East Asia, other countries in this region don't have to defeat China. They have to have the capability to deter China. They have to have the capability to suggest military action would be very costly. That's something which can come from countries in this region, and the U.S. could more easily step back to more of a role kind of as a backup as opposed to the immediate country expected to solve problems, whether it be Scarborough Reef, or be the Senkakus, or it be Paracels, or whatever else, that allows other countries in the region to step up their role. And I would suggest that the controversial issue, it's been raised by members of this institute and others, the question of nuclear proliferation. If North Korea proceeds and moves ahead, what is the proper response? It's not clear to me that the best response is to have the only countries with nuclear weapons in Northeast Asia be, in a sense, the bad guys. And I use that as a very rough term, but looking geopolitically, Russia, China, North Korea are the only countries with nuclear weapons, and everyone else expects the U.S. to be willing to perpetually risk Los Angeles to protect Seoul, Taipei, and Tokyo. I think this is an issue that has to be raised and thought about. There are clearly costs of counterproliferation. It's not a very good option. But I think it needs to be thought through in terms of what is the best security architecture, who should do the defending, how secure is that American extended deterrence as nuclear weapons expand in terms of, especially in North Korea. That this requires dialogue and discussion, not something that one can simply assume away as an issue beyond discussion. So I think that much has been accomplished by the alliance over the last 60 years. I think one of the great successes of American policy is to offer a shield which allowed South Korea, as well as other countries, to grow much stronger, gain economic strength, gain the military ability to secure their own futures. But 60 years on, we are living in a radically different security environment, and alliances should vary depending on security environments. There's a reason that they typically don't last so long, which is the world changes. Our world has changed. It's going to require us to change if this alliance is going to retain viability in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Great, Doug. So basically, the alliance may be unsustainable in its current form. Is essentially, I think, the argument that we need to look more at burden sharing and also look perhaps at different divisions of labor on deterrence. So that should definitely get us into a good discussion later on. Victor.
Thank you, Scott. I too want to thank the Asan Institute for inviting me to the plenum. I really like these red chairs. They're really nice. Yeah. And I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, including our next ROK ambassador to the United States. Welcome. Let me start out with some general observations about alliances, and then talk in particular about how I think the U.S. ROK alliance has evolved over time, because it really has evolved. And the story is really an amazing story if you think about it over 60 years. In the package that they ran to start off, they have this, I was just given this by someone at the embassy. This is the symbol of the 60th anniversary of the relationship, and it's really a very nice graphic. Anyway, so when we think about alliances, well, when I think about alliances, I think about them in sort of three categories. And the first are sort of alliances as we think about them as purely instruments by which states accrete power in dealing with an external threat. And so states can deal with an external threat either by internally balancing, building up their capabilities, or externally balancing, of which a major portion is to form alliances with others, based on a simple overlap of interests. And so in these sorts of relationships, the two allies are not required to have anything else in common except concern about an external threat. And the alliance really lasts about as long as both parties feel it's necessary to meet their security needs. Scott, you mentioned what the average life of an alliance. I mean, I think in most cases, many alliances throughout the history of the international system have been these sorts of alliances that have not lasted very long at all and have come apart once the threat disappears. Then there's another category of alliances which moves beyond this, and they are what one could call essentially security bargains. They are bargains that are made between countries that do face some sort of common external threat. But the alliance isn't simply just this simple overlap of interest. It is a political and security bargain in which you have the creation of rules, norms, how the two states interact, how they cooperate in areas outside of simply the security bargain. There are practices that get created in this relationship. There are even roles that the two partners take in this relationship. A patron ally and a client state, if you will. And these sorts of relationships last longer than simply the overlap of interest because the bargain provides security, but it also provides additional non-security benefits that go beyond simply the fact that you're dealing with an external threat. And then in the last basket of these sorts of alliances at the far end of the spectrum are these alliance bargains that then transform themselves into becoming not just a bargain, but a normative good of some sort, where the alliance reaches a point where relationship becomes indispensable, if you will, that the partners within this particular group feel as though the maintenance of the relationship in and of itself is a good, a normative good that is useful to keep. And there are not many alliances that have reached this category. There maybe are a couple that have reached this category, but that is sort of at the far end of the spectrum. So when we look at the U.S.-Korea alliance, The first observation is it's based on a very strong foundation. Today, a general convergence of interest. There is more that the U.S. and the ROK have in common than not when it comes to the international agenda. At the leadership level, there's a very strong relationship between, and Kim Tae-hyo can speak to this much better than I, a very strong relationship between the leaders of the two countries, famously between President Lee and President Obama, and certainly I think the hope for many is a similar sort of relationship between President Park and President Obama. This year, last month, we are celebrating the one-year anniversary of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, another very good example of how a security relationship can provide non-security benefits for both countries. And the U.S.-Korea alliance really does, I think, take the alliance relationship to a new level. I mean, when I wasn't there for the end of it, but I was certainly there for the beginning of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement when the Bush administration announced that it was going to begin talks on this. And one of the most important arguments for doing this was it wasn't just about trade, but it was about how this was an important way to expand and broaden and deepen the U.S.-Korea alliance beyond simply its military dimension. But on the military dimension, the military relationship is good. Korea has NATO +3 status. OPCON transition appears as though it's on track for 2015. And then, of course, global Korea gives the alliance a broader scope than it's had before and allows the two countries to act, whether it's in terms of peacekeeping or overseas development assistance, on a wide variety of areas where the alliance has not been as active in the past. So as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the alliance, we have to reflect on what drove the alliance for the past 60 years. And so for the first 40 years of this relationship, the alliance was very much the way I described the first basket of alliances. It was, the primary driver of this relationship was the external threat. This was the quintessential Cold War alliance relationship. Two countries that had really nothing in common. The U.S. had no idea about Korea. In fact, U.S. grand strategy at the end of the Second World War and before June of 1950 basically wrote off Korea. That it was considered to be a part of the mainland, and that was continental Asia, and that was not a place that the United States wanted to be involved in. And if not for June of 1950, Kennan's view of the Korean Peninsula would have stood, but obviously that didn't happen. And even during the Cold War, the relationship, again based on an external threat, was not one in which there was a lot of shared commonalities. In fact, it was not a very friendly relationship at all, and it had many of the tensions that you had between a democracy and a dictatorship. But then when we get to the post-Cold War period, you could argue that external threats were still important to this alliance relationship, but one of the key drivers in the post-Cold War period were values. In the sense that, and given the time constraints, let me just say in shorthand, if the Cold War alliance was about what the U.S. and the ROK stood against, the post-Cold War iteration of this relationship was about what the alliance stood for. And this includes things like values and democracy and human rights and development. And I think this was a very good direction in which the alliance went after the end of the Cold War in Asia. But today, and this is in part relates to the themes that we talked about earlier this morning, today I think the driver, these other things are still important. Obviously, there's still a threat, and there's still a values-based relationship. But the driver I think we need to watch very carefully for this alliance now is domestic politics. because it's not that domestic politics didn't exist before, but there were a lot of structural factors that suppressed the role that domestic politics could play in outcomes in the alliance relationship. And that is less the case today. And the effect of domestic politics is on outcomes in the alliance is, first, it makes it more complex. Right? Secondly, it makes it much more multifaceted. And thirdly, and this is the point that I'll focus on, potentially it makes it a lot more divisive. Domestic political imperatives can pull the U.S. ROK alliance agenda in all sorts of different directions without a high degree of predictability. And then you also have this feedback loop where international imperatives get filtered through a domestic lens in which, and somebody mentioned this earlier in this morning, in which sort of you get international issues that get refracted through a domestic prism, of which a big part is this connection between social media and nationalism. Right? And I think this is one of the biggest challenges for managing the alliance relationship. And let me just give you 3 issues in this regard. And these are all issues that you're familiar with. One of them, of course, is the 123 agreement, the civil nuclear agreement. This, again, is an example of something in which there are international imperatives, initiatives, the ROK's desire to be a global civilian nuclear energy player that connects very much with a domestic agenda easily fueled by nationalism and media. Another is SMA, the Special Measures Agreement. This is a negotiation that will start in which, as my colleague mentioned, the United States is in a sequester right now. And this is going to be, these SMA negotiations are always difficult. We used to joke about how the SMA negotiators, those were the most difficult negotiations because they weren't about mythical things like denuclearizing North Korea. They were about real, that was a joke. They were about real things, which is money, right? They're about real things and they really matter. And so these are always difficult negotiations, and I think this will become, in many ways, a very political negotiation here because of the domestic political imperatives on the U.S. side. And then the third issue I had mentioned is the relationship between Japan and the ROK. The United States view has always been that strong Japan-ROK relations are a part of our alliance with the ROK as well as our alliance with Japan. But it's very clear and evident these days that the Seoul-Tokyo relationship, for domestic political reasons, are not very good at all. And it's hard to see at this point how it's going to get better. I don't see how we're going to get out of the cycle that we're now in. Let me close by saying that of all the things that I mentioned, the issue that I don't think will be one that is divisive between the two countries is North Korea. I don't think this will be a divisive issue. In no small part because the U.S. Policy of strategic patience essentially is a policy that prizes coordination with the ROK over anything else when it comes to DPRK. And that you could argue 90% of U.S. policy to DPRK today is staying coordinated with Seoul, ensuring that there are no splits. So in a sense, that really means that the direction that Seoul wants to go in will be the direction that Washington will want to go in. And so that's why, without getting into forecasting about the summit, which is why I think the summit is so important, the meeting next week, because in many ways, I think Washington is waiting to hear what President Park's view is on how to move forward in terms of this issue. So it's very hard to end a talk about North Korea in an optimistic way. But I just did it because I don't think North Korea is going to be a problem in the relationship like these other issues, and that the U.S. and ROK will coordinate quite well in terms of policy.
Well, thanks, Victor, for giving us a picture of how the alliance has evolved. But I think really more interestingly, how even with the transition from a threat-based alliance to a values-based alliance, there are still a lot of internal factors that pose real challenges that could even derail alliance cooperation. And so now we'll shift over to Tae-hyo for a South Korean view.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be part of this session, and I'm pleased to meet all good friends all together here at the same time. And to save the time and to have more lively Q&A session after our brief remarks, I'll just try to focus on two major points regarding ROK-US alliance. So far, for the last 4 or 5 years, I think global Korea concept and its past performance greatly contributed to expanding the geographical and conceptual range of the bilateral alliance. And now I think we need to go back to the starting point to reshape our North Korea policy and rethink our future inter-Korean relationship in terms of our alliance between ROK and the United States. Because already based upon this well-shaped global scope of the bilateral alliance, I think this is the best time and the important momentum for us to rethink our future strategy and the specific options available in front of us. So far, I think Pyongyang contributed to us in 2 points. One is to increase and sustain jobs in South Korea, kind of creating creative economy. They allow more jobs for North Korean specialists here. So they contributed to South Korean economy in security sense. Second point is they allowed us to realize that a six-party negotiation is not anymore available for us. That very clear-cut and definite conclusion was given to us by North Korea for the last several months simply because of North Korean domestic leadership problem. Our last six-party talk meeting was in December 2008, the first year of Lee Myung-bak administration. That was right after the illness of the Kim Jong-il. So North Korea's succession problem and their domestic political struggle closed the window for any constructive discussion in the realm of the six-party talk. Without this domestic problem, North Korea could have prolonged and earned more time by appearing in the process of the six-party talk, escaping the hard target and resisting to talk about a highly enriched uranium program and opposing against IAEA inspection. But simply because of this domestic complex political situation, they gave us very simple conclusion. That is, I think, Park Geun-hye administration and the second term Obama administration will have to simply focus on 3 homeworks from now on, rather than negotiating with North Korea on nuclear issue. One is to reinforce the military preparedness against North Korean nuclear and asymmetric attack against our alliance. In order to do that, I think we have to reshape our surveillance system and also strengthen a cruise and ballistic missile capability, and also recombine and relink the 2 military and strategic mechanisms in the preparation for the OPCON transport. And second homework is to tighten our international coordination and our practice of the existing 4 major UN security resolution. In that way, we can minimize any strategic support that could be used for North Korean nuclear program. And also we need to be more creative and flexible in thinking about effective options to slow the North Korean nuclear program. The third one is to encourage any official and unofficial changes in North Korean society. Not only the expansion of the markets, we need to think about various political, diplomatic, and economic options to impact on the perception of North Korean leaders and possible differences and internal debates on the future of North Korean external policy. In that way, in the combination of local change and central change, I think we can broaden our window of opportunity for any peaceful change in North Korean society. My second subject is about a future, a multilateral approach for a North Korean problem. So far, a conventional wisdom has been focused on trilateral security cooperation among the US, Japan, and the ROK. But as you see, the current diplomatic and political climate between Japan and Korea threatens the future direction of the trilateral cooperation, which has been the value-driven trilateral security cooperation so far. And the trilateral annual meeting among China, Korea, Japan has been postponed, and Korea is searching for alternative trilateral strategic talk among China, US, and Korea. And there is some difference between the existing value-driven three-way cooperation and other two. I think China, Korea, US possible talk will be driven by their strategic convenience. China is concerned about the future of North Korea, so they really want to listen to Korea and US proposals and future thinkings, how to deal with North Korean WMD capability, and how to prepare for any contingency situations in Korean Peninsula. So minimum but very useful and meaningful understanding could be started among this new three-way dialogue among Korea, China, and the United States. The other one, regional talk, China, Japan, Korean talk, is not effective to directly attack security issues and North Korean problem, but it could be a very lubricating mechanism to talk about commercial issues and climate change issues and personal changes and exchanges among these three countries so that they can prepare for any future post-current North Korean situation, North Korean trilateral cooperations. I think that new venue should be gradually cultivated by these three regional countries. And finally, as Victor Cha mentioned, Korean leadership will meet severe challenges for the 4 years from now on. That is to face anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korean public society, and also regularly interrupting anti-American sentiment in South Korea. Easy way is to swallow and adapt to the existing public opinion, but that will sacrifice Korea and US long-term strategic interest. So preemptively, they have to plunge into the public relations policy, how to wisely separate public sentiment from national policy options. And sometimes negotiators are rushing to make some negotiation, but eventually I think negotiation itself is just a mean to realize our public purposes. So sometimes it takes more time, but you need to wisely handle and overcome these existing sentiments. Otherwise, I think we will not have more options in our hands to overcome existing challenges and many takes ahead of us in and around Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
If I were to summarize what Tae-hyo had to say, it would be the more things change, the more they stay the same with regards to coordination toward North Korea and the ongoing challenge of trying to figure out the right formula for addressing the regional environment. And that provides a very nice segue to move to what we might call an outside view of the U.S.-Korea alliance from Shen Dingli.
Well, the alliance was made 60 years ago for a reason. We hope the reason will be gone, so the alliance will lose its rationale to continue. Unfortunately, the reason has not begun. To some extent, it could have been enhanced. So we see somehow enhanced alliance between Seoul and Washington. That was generated for a purpose, to deter aggression. To some extent, it succeeds. Since 1953, no massive effort of military sort from the north to liberate the south. So they keep having some incursion. Sometimes they send the small troops to place close to the presidential office. That's a threat, but not a large scale, not often. This success partly due to the alliance. Without the discouragement due to the alliance, they might be doing more. But the alliance did not stop their ideology. They keep thinking this country is illegal, which was China's thinking prior to 1992. We transformed for our changed ideology, development, security through development, through engaging ROK economically and peacefully. We strengthen our national security. So we changed, they refused to change. So in their perspective, they still are entitled to liberate, to save South Korean people, and to rid Americans military stationing, including nuclear stationing as late as 1991. That's their discourse. They keep using it to justify their own system and their political and security handling vis-a-vis the South. As long as they keep doing this, I think it's hopeless that China can see the dissolvement of ROK-US alliance. But we have been accustomed to this for the last 60 years. We are not comfortable completely, but we have been accustomed. We have small amount of uncomfortableness due to this, because South Korea for small period, few weeks, disallowed the U.S. force stationed in South Korea to be mobile in Northeast Asia. And the President Romo for a reason, but that catered China's demand. But under the same president, few weeks later, his government returned to the old policy, which is the current policy, to allow the U.S. force in South Korea to be mobile in Northeast Asia. And we feel somehow uncomfortable with the Taiwan picture in consideration. But as a comparison, China used to generate its own alliance with North Korea 8 years after this alliance was made. We think this is a collective defense, good, empowers China, and made North Korea to be able to deter any aggression. But now, with China's change of ideology, security through a broadened perspective, including economic development. So China is increasingly confident that our military security, that defense security, may not need our friend in Pyongyang to assist. So we may have some subtle or nuanced change in seeing our own allies vis-a-vis the US ROK alliance. We may think we are powerful enough, we do not need them to help us. And therefore, on reciprocal basis, we do not need to assist them when they need us, for whatever reason. So I see, in the wake of North Korea's first nuclear test in October 2006, our foreign ministry spokesperson, Liu Jiancao, rebuffed the question about the blood bond alliance. He responded, "What blood bond alliance? I seem not to have heard of." He seemed to openly challenge there has been the existence of the 1961 China-North Korea Mutual Defense Alliance. So since there is no alliance, why do we need to be bound to defend? So that's China's first public, new, but still nuanced. He said that he did not know. That means he is not a qualified spokesperson. You shouldn't know. You should never tell others, "I'm not a qualified spokesperson." But a week ago, our defense ministry spokesperson made a better nuanced statement. When asked a similar question, he stated, the question was whether China would be bound by its treaty obligation to defend North Korea. He stated, "This is a question based on assumption. North Korea would be invaded. I do not want to respond to a question based on assumption. If I do, tomorrow my friend would tell me I'm not a professional." Still nuanced whether we would defend North Korea or not. But he did not say, I'm not informed that there is such existence. It's there. So I think that's systematic China's nuanced change to delink itself from its treaty obliged responsibility. We think we are more powerful. We can defend ourselves, so China would limit its national defense more to its self-reliance, to less need collective defense. But we have not refused collective defense. We just say, "I do not know, I'm not sure. Until that happens, I will tell you." It's a change. We may think North Korea is making more trouble. Is a troublemaker. So if we are associated with such a troublemaker, testing nuclear stuff for 3 times, ignoring all IAEA and UN Security Council resolution, which demands it not to repeat or to face sanction. Say, almost name China, that China has been so partial not to stick to justice, to speak for America and South Korea. They were very angry. And China has no regret. We will continue our principled position that proliferation of nuclear weapon is not accepted and has a consequence. And we work with other countries to bring the consequence. Our Ministry of Communication, 交通部, a few days ago, issued a national order. All Chinese local custom cross-border agency should severely, very closely follow the UN Security Council resolution made in March 2013 to sanction North Korea's third nuclear weapon test. They claim, I'm not sure if they did. So we never openly make an order. And we may internally make an order before, or not, but this time openly, to tell the world. The Committee of 1540 should have no worry that China would bypass the previous sanction. And we honor our word. This is not acceptable, and we will teach a lesson to them. Material sanction. Because no luxurious item, no boat, no caveat, and no banned stuff. And the mentioned man operating in China should be restricted. So it's our way in handling our airlines vis-a-vis US ROK airlines. We are still uncomfortable, but not very uncomfortable with your airlines. But we become more uncomfortable with our airlines. That's a change.
Okay. So what
Conclusion.
I'm hearing, sorry.
Conclusion. I would hope why the US and ROK would lift the quality of their deterrence. Bring South Korea more security by engaging not only South Korea, Japan, but also China proactively. Inviting Chinese side to join the US military action in the wake of November 2010 Yanbian sharing. China was not invited. Most likely when invited, China would refuse, but invite. China will be happy to join the Ring Pacific exercise, but without invitation, we feel lonely. I would think, take it easy, we are lonely. But if you invite, we feel less lonely. We feel a little more comfortable, and we will make a contribution to the purpose of the exercise, which is to have a cooperative security effort to make the region more peaceful. So let's US side more engage us, let us not only keep a distance with North Korea. When we want to do this, we may generate unintended consequences that North Korea would feel more isolated, more resentful against the US, ROK, Japan, and more against China. So China would lose its leverage and credibility. So I would suggest that China should not deny that there is such existence. And we are proud to have an allies, but only for mutual defense. If we are attacked in the first place, welcome you to defend us. And if you are attacked, you have right to refuse us, but you have rights to request, but only for mutual defense. If it's Yanbian Island, if it's Chongnan, if it's nuclear weapon testing, no way.
Okay.
So that's my suggestion, that we should have a balanced position toward North Korea. You should have a balanced, expanded security engagement with all stakeholders in the region. This way, we may have better chance to have more effective handling of DPRK.
So what I'm hearing from Dingli is ambivalence about the U.S.-Korea alliance, ambivalence about the China-North Korea alliance, and China is lonely. I really want to get to questions, but I would just make the observation that North Korea really thrives on divisions in the external community, and the current environment has plenty of divisions, and so I want to ask panelists to address that. But let's turn it over for some questions before you do that, so that we have a chance to hear from the audience. Okay, right down here.
Hello, Hello, my name is Yong-sun Jin, student of Asan Academy. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, even if the ROK and U.S. alliance has a very long history of trust, but in these days, you have some difficulty negotiating in the ROK-U.S. Atomic Energy Agreement. So I think it can be an obstacle to the alliance. So how can we solve this problem? And the second question is that when it comes to strategic patience policy of U.S. to deal with the North Korean nuclear capability, I think to me that policy seems like there's nothing to do. I mean, nothing to do to solve that problem. So, is there any feasible way to make North Korean government give up the North Korean capability? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sure that everybody wishes they had the answer to that question. Any other questions that we can take? Yeah, Chris.
Thanks, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thanks for indulging my questions all day. I really appreciate it. Shen Dingli really makes some interesting points, and it raises in my mind a question. As you know, in many ways, one of the bedrocks of U.S. policy towards North Korea has always been, if only China would, fill in the blanks, do more, cut off the oil for 4 days, not 3 days, all that kind of thing. And we're still saying that. Secretary Kerry is saying that on his trip, and it's mentioned every time there's a congressional hearing. When you hear that as a Chinese intellectual, but also an advisor to your government, what's your reaction to that? Does it help people who would like to see more change in China's view or policy toward North Korea to have the Americans doing that, or does it just drive you crazy and just seem to be poking you to no good effect? I'd be interested in this constant repetition of China has to do more. How does that affect you? And I was wondering for the panel, it does look like President Park and President Obama at the summit next week are going to discuss the potential viability of the South Koreans taking the lead for now, given the Obama administration's futility of trying to take the lead or to do another leap day. I'm wondering what the panel's sense of that is, and also, I hate to put you constantly on the spot. What's your sense of how your government will react to the notion of South Korea taking the lead to try to get some confidence-building measures going to try to reestablish a dialogue? So, two separate questions. Thank you.
Okay, and I also want to place one additional question that was from the guiding questions list to the panelists, and then we'll just go down the row and have each person give a couple of minutes of response. And the question is, how critical is a repair of ROK-Japan relations to U.S. interests? Is it a necessary factor or merely desirable? And this obviously gets at the Japan-Korea piece, which I think both Tae-hyo and Victor have special research expertise on. So why don't we go in reverse order, and I'll have Dingli start and answer Chris's questions.
I think China is very frustrated. And President Jiang Zemin thought U.S. threatened North Korea. So if U.S. would not reduce its threat, what we can do? President Hu Jintao considered that even U.S. threatened North Korea, we can still help. If we don't intervene, that we will be threatened by their inability to reconcile. But then we overestimated our strength. We think it's something that we can handle. But it turns out that we overestimated ourselves. And we have internal debate whether North Korea is genuine in developing this or developed this as a bargaining chip with US. Now we believe it's not a bargaining chip. Or it's a less purpose of bargaining chip. Primarily, they are a hyper-realist country. And then what we can do? I think we're still struggling, searching for a solution, a carrot and a stick. But each time when they did one more nuclear test, you have to provide a more sweetened carrot to bring them back. Then after a year or two, they negated it. Then we waste our resource, and in order to bring them back, you have to lift the enticement. It's very frustrated. Now they seem to be openly opposing to China, to condemn Russia and China, because we seem not to have conscious 良心 to stick to justice, 不讲正义. With China's older mentality, our pre-cultural revolution mentality, we must agree with them. They use our old discourse to be against China's current discourse. But we think we 与时俱进, evolved, we transformed, not enough adequate to meet our friends' expectation, but leaving them far behind. So our current government is still searching for a solution. I think the current format is the president himself openly standing out to speak in both our Asian forum, to state that we don't allow any country to slow the entire region and the world into chaos. 不允许任何国家出于一己私利，把整个地区和世界丢入到混乱之中。That's China's
We're going to need a
president.
translation of that, I think.
And then Prime Minister Li Keqiang stated, anyone who would do this kind of thing would 搬起石头砸自己的脚。Then Wang Yi stated, don't allow anyone to bring chaos to China's doorstep. The importance is action, not only rhetoric action. Then 交通部 stated, 所有的海关、所有的边关要严格检查，一定要遵守联合国安理会决议。That's very tough. That's to cater our friend's concern. China may not be serious. We agreed in New York, but not serious in the region. We tell our friend we are very serious.
Yeah.
I want to suggest to my government to invite our South Korean friend to jointly search if any vehicle coming from North or coming from China across the border would carry some not unpermitted item. If South Korea is too sensitive, what about Cambodia or Vietnam? To implement 1540. So we want to be serious to tell them you have a consequence. But if you can be responsible, these days they are lowering the intensity of rhetorical aggressiveness. I think we should give them a step to go down.
Okay.
To encourage their less threatening behavior. Even it's still threatening, but it's less threatening. We have to encourage good behavior and punish bad behavior. And China-US should work wholeheartedly. So Taiwan is always in our mind. But for this issue, what about leaving Taiwan behind? We work wholeheartedly to resolve a major challenge to contemporary international security. That would build our confidence in catering the Taiwan issue. So this is my opinion.
Okay, and we can only leave it to our imagination what the Chinese
And
language threat
for
was.
your question,
Yeah.
Japan, South Korea, I would say it's a question based on assumption.
Okay.
I don't answer
We'll
such a question.
We'll give Tae-hyo a shot at that then, because why don't you?
Okay. I'd like to answer two questions. One is strategic patience, and the other one is Japan factor. Strategic patience, to my understanding, is not to sit down and doing nothing. It is a strategy to patiently find out a good momentum for us to reshape the North Korean agenda into our own national security interest, which means a past repetitive cycle was to resume dialogue with North Korea in the circle of North Korean strategy and their own political agenda. In that way, in the past, we could not deal with a North Korean core nuclear program, but we tended to be a peacemaking actors by having some summit meeting with North Korea 2 times in the past. And also the second Bush administration accepted a North Korean deal by releasing Banco Delta Asia and the terror supporting group nations list. That was simply to handle North Korea and try to stop North Korea from making any further provocation in the last year of presidential term. And also last year's Leap Day agreement was the same thing. We were patient enough, but we were not patient enough to strike a deal what we really intended with North Korea. So this is the time to strategically wait and find a very good momentum for us to lead and initiate our discussion with North Korea into the way of North Korean change, positive change, and also if any, some chances for denuclearization of North Korea. Japan thing, I think Korea should think about 2 things. One is TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Economic Agreement, inviting Japan and United States and other countries. This one I think Korea should do, and there will be a lot of opportunities also for ROK, because already Korea signed 47 bilateral free trade agreements so far. So it is not Korea's challenge, but rather I think this one is Japan's challenge, because bilateral free trade agreement with South Korea so far has not been so effective. So same challenge will be given to change, given to Japan, whether or not they really can open up their agriculture and fishery markets to United States and Korea. But GSOMIA and AXA, this one is very political and emotional. So into the way of 50th anniversary of Korea-Japan normalization, 2015, I think Japan and Korea should reestablish their very frank and effective pipeline with each other to escape any political troubles into the next 3 years. But they have to sincerely talk about past history issues and also resuming security cooperation and institutional mechanisms for it. In that way, China is another factor. Japan and United States might be interested in including the notion of China factor when we think about trilateral security cooperation among Japan, Korea, and United States. But maybe Korean government will want to limit or focus more on North Korean factor. They think about the trilateral.
Thanks, Tae-hyo. Victor?
Well, let me talk about the questions, the 1, 2, 3, and then Japan. On the 1, 2, 3, the civil nuclear agreement, if you look at all the contours of this issue, this is one that is tailor-made to be a real problem in the alliance relationship, because there are so many elements of it that can cause disruption, and that, you know, in any relationship, there's sort of the good side and the ugly side. This one has the potential to raise all of the ugly issues in the relationship, having to do with sovereignty and nationalism and all of these sort of very negative things. And I think so, for very good reason, the decision was made to extend, simple extension of the agreement for 2 years. But I am not all confident that somehow we are going to be able to close the gap within 2 years, because the two sides are so far apart. And the other thing is that both sides have very credible arguments, but both sides, their arguments could also be undercut. Right? So this has all the elements, I think, of a very, what we like to refer to these sorts of things in Washington as a train wreck in slow motion. That's what I think we have with this, and I'm really not sure aside from continuing to extend it for 2 years and 2 years and 2 years till you're out of both the Obama and Park governments and they just kick it down to the next government, I think that this has the potential to be a real problem in the relationship. I mean, the way it's talked about here already, I think is, in a sense, quite problematic in focusing on things like nationalism and, well, you let Japan do it, but why don't you let and trust, you know, these, it can be very poisonous. On ROK Japan, whether it's necessary or just a nice thing to have, I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary not just for dealing with North Korea, but I think it's necessary for the overall U.S. position in the region. If not in an instrumental sense, historically, I think just by tradition, the U.S. has always felt like this three-way relationship or improving the third leg of this three-way relationship has always been important for U.S. interests. The problem is, I think that at the rate we're going now, we're headed for a real crisis in Seoul-Tokyo relations. You know, in part because of the history issues, you know, probably coming sometime in the summer, late summer, early fall. It looks like the Abe government is moving in a particular direction on some of these hot button political / historical issues, and it's very clear that the ROK government here and the public have absolutely no tolerance for this anymore. And so I'm quite concerned that we are headed for a crisis in this relationship, and it's problematic for the United States because it may require the United States to do something it does not want to do when it comes to these sorts of issues, and that's take a side. But at the rate this thing is moving, it looks like the U.S. may have to take a side, which is something that it's never done in this three-way relationship, and that would be a new dynamic to deal with as well.
Okay, well, it's nice that you've replaced North Korea with all these other issues to be pessimistic about. Doug, hopefully you can cheer us up.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, can we make North Korea give up nuclear weapons? The answer is no. I mean, we've spent 20 years trying to find the formula. War would be an awful, awful alternative, especially if you live in the Seoul-Incheon area. I wouldn't want to be here if that was tried. We've tried sanctions, even with Chinese support. It's not clear to me that North Korea would give up its nuclear weapons. If it's willing to let 500,000 people starve to death, I mean, this is a regime that's utterly unconcerned about its people, so it'd be quite willing to accept enormous costs. And negotiation works only if the other party wants to negotiate and wants to give up its weapons. And my guess is that for both external and internal reasons, this regime wants to be a nuclear state. It offers security advantages, prestige, the opportunity to extort, and also I suspect there's an internal political dynamic. I doubt the civilian leadership wants to go to the military and say, we're going to take away your biggest toy. I just can't believe that's a way to maintain internal political stability within North Korea, especially relatively early into a leadership transition where I think who has what authority and where the power lines are still somewhat unclear. I'm quite happy for the ROK to take the lead on North Korea policy. I think the Obama administration, number one, has no interest. They view it as a complete loser, nothing to be gained, a waste of time, frustrating, and they have no ideas. They kind of tried everything, nothing works. Why get into this? Moreover, South Korea has the most at stake. The country that is most vulnerable to the north is South Korea. Despite funny YouTube videos showing New York going up in flames, North Korea doesn't have that capability. And I don't think they're suicidal. I don't think they would try it. Clearly Seoul is much more vulnerable to the north. It makes a lot of sense, I think, for South Korea to take the lead on those issues. The ROK-Japanese relationship, I think there are enormous problems there. It's highly desirable, it's necessary, whatever term you want to use. But I think the U.S. has no better ability to make Seoul and Tokyo kiss and make up than it can make North Korea give up its nuclear weapons. Internal politics clearly is dominating in both countries. It's very dangerous because it would be very helpful for two democratic allies that in fact share, I think, security interests and many other things to work together, but that relationship is not at a good stage. And finally, on China, I think it's important not to overestimate China's ability. I think China has enormous influence in the North, but again, even there, even if China cut off all food and energy, what would the North do? Again, the North might decide, let people starve, we're not giving in. Maybe the regime would implode, who knows what would happen. It's not clear to me that we get the result we want, and it's not going to happen without addressing China's concerns. China wants stability, it doesn't want conflict on the peninsula, it doesn't want mass refugee flows. I think it's concerned about security and what a united Korea would look like in the role of American troops. Unless there's a serious, sustained effort to engage China on those issues and talk about them and about how to assuage Chinese concerns, I just don't believe that China is going to take enormous risks when it comes to what it perceives as stability of its ally.
Okay, Victor.
Just on the Japan ROK thing, I think, you know, and I apologize, Scott, you've heard me say this before, but, you know, analytically, the problem is right now that, you know, I guess like the North, you can never resolve these historical issues between these two countries. I mean, Japan can apologize forever, and South Korea can complain forever that the apology is not enough. So you try to manage the issue, right? And accept that there's always going to be a degree of tension in the relationship because of these issues. The problem comes when people start to change the status quo, right? That's when you start getting problems, and that's when you start getting spiraling tensions. And so President Lee going to Tokyo, that's changing the status quo. That's bound to create problems. Or the Abe government reinterpreting the Kono statement. That's changing the status quo. And once you do that, then these issues, they catch fire in a way that you cannot control. And you know, I think over the past year and moving forward, on some of these issues, not just Korea and Japan, but also China, we're heading down this road now. And there doesn't seem, for domestic reasons, for a variety of reasons, and there doesn't really seem to be an off-ramp. There's no off-ramp. And so that's why this is quite concerning, I think, and a challenge for the alliance.
Yeah. So basically what I'm hearing, especially about Japan-South Korea relations, is that cooperation is necessary but impossible. And also that North Korea is still good glue for the ROK-US alliance, but in a value-based alliance framework, we've got other emerging issues that actually might be a bigger threat and challenge or potential train wreck to manage going forward. So I presume that this topic will remain on the agenda at future Asan Plenums. Please join me in thanking our speakers. Appreciate you.